the richest land in the world, overflowing with silk, spices, and gold. And yet, it fell not to armies, but to whispers in the shadows. This is the story of Bengal's betrayal, where ambition and treachery would change India forever. Bengal fell not to cannons, but to contracts, and the richest province in India became a business ledger overnight. It began not with a roar of cannons, but with a whisper in a faraway office in London. On a damp morning in 1600, the East India Company was born, a chartered trade enterprise with the world in its sights. No one could have predicted that this company of merchants, armed with ledgers and letters, would one day topple kingdoms. Bengal, in the early 18th century, was a jewel among empires. Its rivers shimmered with wealth. Its cities overflowed with silk, saltpeter, and spices. The Nawab ruled with power tempered by tradition, surrounded by courtiers and generals who guarded the land like hawks. From the coastlines to the interiors, commerce thrived under Mughal administration. Life seemed ordered, predictable, but change was lurking in the shadows. The East India Company had already learned the art of patience. Years of trading along India's western coast had taught them a single truth. To conquer, one need not march armies. One only needs influence. Contracts, loans, and alliances could bend empires more effectively than steel. Bengal, with its wealth, became the prize everyone coveted. By the 1740s, the company's men had quietly established themselves in Bengal's ports. Calcutta, a small settlement, became their fortress. To the locals, these foreigners were merchants and clerks. To history, they were the seeds of a silent empire. Behind their polite bows and trade negotiations lay strategy, observation, and subtle coercion. Every gift, every loan, every bribe planted threads of control across the province. But Bengal was no weak land. Its rulers were sharp, proud, and fiercely protective of their sovereignty. Alivardi Khan, the Nawab at the time, maintained order through a delicate balance, repelling Maratha raiders in the west, managing taxes, and keeping the company's ambitions at bay. Yet even he could not predict the storm gathering in the east. The company's men studied Bengal like a chessboard. They noted the rivalries among nobles, the tensions between generals, and the loyalties of soldiers. They learned that in Bengal, money could speak louder than swords. And so, in secret rooms with candlelight flickering over maps and ledgers, plans began to take shape. By 1756, Alivardi Khan's grandson, Siraj-ud-Dawla, ascended the throne. Young, proud, and suspicious of foreign interference, he immediately sensed the growing presence of the company. Fortifications were questioned, privileges demanded, trade restrictions imposed. Every action was met with resistance from the British, led by men who had learned one unshakable lesson. Bengal could be won, but only if its rulers were first weakened from within. Robert Clive, a man who had risen from clerk to commander through cunning and sheer audacity, had been sent to Bengal years earlier. Observing the political tides, he realized that conquest would require more than armies. It would require betrayal, manipulation, and timing so precise it would rival any battlefield strategy. The stage was being set for a war unlike any the subcontinent had seen, fought not only with cannons, but with gold, loyalty, and deceit. And so, in the bustling courts and riverbanks of Bengal, invisible lines were drawn. Every loan, every promise, every whispered suggestion planted seeds of doubt and ambition. Generals, ministers, and nobles could not see it yet, but the web of influence was tightening. When the first shot finally fell, it would seem sudden. But in reality, It had been decades in the making. In the months ahead, the British would face a choice: retreat or strike with a weapon more lethal than any army. And behind closed doors, a betrayal was quietly being purchased. A betrayal that would shake the foundations of Bengal forever. The young Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah inherited a Bengal brimming with wealth and tension. Palaces glimmered under the sun, markets overflowed with silks and spices, and rivers carried ships laden with treasures to the world. But beneath this glittering surface, fissures ran deep. Local nobles squabbled, generals eyed each other with suspicion, and even the peasants whispered of rising taxes and mounting debts. Siraj was proud and impulsive, a ruler who saw threats everywhere, and he immediately fixed his gaze on the newcomers in Calcutta. The East India Company, with its small fleet and few hundred soldiers, appeared weak at first glance. But Siraj had learned from whispers. Wealth often concealed power sharper than any sword. And in this case, those merchants weren't just trading. They were watching, calculating, waiting. The tension escalated quickly. The Nawab demanded that the British remove their fortifications, fearing that the walls and cannons in Calcutta were a step toward subjugation. The company refused, not out of arrogance, but calculation. Their leaders, led by the ambitious Robert Clive, understood that a direct confrontation with the Nawab could be avoided. For now. They had other tools: gold, promises, and the carefully measured art of persuasion. Clive, once a bored clerk, dreaming of escape from obscurity, had transformed in India. He had watched kingdoms rise and fall, armies march and retreat, and he had learned a single rule. To control India, one needed to control the loyalties of those who held power within it. And in Siraj's court, there were always men willing to betray, if the price was right. Behind the doors of Calcutta's warehouses and offices, letters changed hands in the dead of night. Generals and ministers who felt slighted by their young Nawab found themselves courted by Clive. Promises of wealth, power, and even titles were whispered across candles and ink-stained desks. These men were the hinges on which the fate of Bengal would turn. Meanwhile, the Nawab fortified his resolve. He inspected his cannons, drilled his troops, and prepared his elephants, living tanks of war that had terrified invaders for centuries. He sent emissaries to the company, demanding compliance, but Clive's responses were polite, calculating, and cold. Every delay, every word, every seemingly trivial disagreement was part of a larger plan. The British were not bluffing. They were shaping destiny from the shadows. As the rainy season approached, tension boiled into action. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, frustrated by British obstinance, made the fateful decision to march on Calcutta. He would seize Fort William, the company's jewel in Bengal, and show the Europeans that the Nawab's authority could not be challenged. His army of 50,000 men, elephants, and artillery began its march, a spectacle of power and pride that would echo through Bengal's plains. Clive, however, was ready. He had just over 3,000 troops, a fraction of the Nawab's numbers. But numbers alone did not determine victory in this game. Years of observation, planning, and manipulation had taught him that some battles were won before a shot was fired. Key figures in Siraj's own army had already been promised rewards for inaction or betrayal. Among them was Mir Jafar, the commander whose ambitions could be exploited. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape Bengal forever. As Siraj's forces approached, tensions inside the Nawab's camp grew. Some generals questioned strategy, others whispered fears of treachery. The young Nawab, proud and impulsive, dismissed them. unaware that the real threat was not Clive's cannons, but the gold and promises quietly circulating in the shadows. On the eve of battle, Clive studied maps and letters by candlelight. He traced lines of loyalty and influence, knowing exactly which men would falter, which generals would hesitate, and which hearts could be bought. Every movement in the Nawab's camp had been anticipated. The British position was weak on paper, yet unassailable in reality. Dawn broke over Calcutta and the surrounding plains. The riverbanks glimmered under the rising sun, shrouded in mist that blurred the outlines of armies. Siraj-ud-Dowlah's elephants trumpeted, banners fluttered, and the air hummed with anticipation. Clive's men waited under cover of trees and fortifications, silent and tense. It was not yet a battle. It was a collision of strategy, pride, and deception. As the first cannon fired, the ground shook. Siraj's troops unleashed volleys, elephants charged, and muskets cracked through the mist. Yet, a key division in the Nawab's army remained eerily still. Mir Jafar's soldiers, loyal in appearance but bribed in secret, did not advance. The momentum of Bengal's army faltered. Confusion spread like wildfire. In the chaos, Clive moved decisively. His troops, disciplined and strategic, took positions to exploit gaps in the enemy lines. The elephants panicked under controlled cannon fire, trampling their own men. Siraj, realizing betrayal was at hand, attempted to rally his forces. But too late. The threads of loyalty that Clive had spun months in advance now snapped into action, turning the tide before a true battle had even been fought. By midday, the battlefield was in ruins. Thousands of Siraj's soldiers lay dead or fleeing. The British had suffered minimal losses. And in the heart of the chaos, Mir Jafar rode to Clive's camp, sealing the bargain that had determined the fate of Bengal. The Nawab's power had been shattered, not by force alone, but by manipulation, foresight, and calculated treachery. Calcutta remained in British hands. Siraj fled, humiliated and betrayed, while the company consolidated its control. This was not merely a victory. It was the blueprint of modern empire. A land conquered through strategy, bribery, and psychological warfare, rather than sheer military might. The wealth of Bengal, its rivers, its crops, and its people, now flowed under British influence. The foundations of the Raj were quietly being laid, one ledger, one alliance, and one betrayal at a time. Yet the story of Bengal was far from over. Even as Clive celebrated his triumph, the seeds of resistance and rebellion were being sown. Tipu Sultan, Hyder Ali, Maratha leaders, names that would challenge the British in the decades to come, were already watching, waiting, and preparing. Bengal had fallen, but India's spirit had not. The conquest of Calcutta and the betrayal of Siraj-ud-Dowlah marked the beginning of a new era, an era where commerce, cunning, and control would shape history more profoundly than swords and cannons ever could. The roar of victory in Calcutta had barely faded when the East India Company realized that controlling the battlefield was only the first step. True power lay elsewhere, in ledgers, in trade routes, and in the silent corridors of administration. Bengal was not merely a land to be conquered, it was an empire to be tamed. And the key to this control was the Diwani, the right to collect revenue. Clive returned to the company's directors with a bold proposal. The British would not simply remain traders in Bengal, they would become rulers in all but name. Mir Jafar, the man whose treachery had won the day, was made Nawab, a puppet whose strings the company could pull. But real authority, the flow of money, the taxation, the extraction of Bengal's immense wealth, would rest with the East India Company. Obtaining the Diwani in 1765 was a masterstroke. It granted the company legal control over the region's revenue collection, effectively making them the de facto rulers. No longer just merchants, they had become administrators, arbiters of law, and the ultimate gatekeepers of Bengal's resources. The rivers that once carried goods freely now funneled wealth to warehouses in Calcutta, ready to be shipped to London. But administration was not merely about collecting money. It required intelligence, coercion, and psychological insight. The company had to manage not only the land, but also the people, from zamindars to peasants, from generals to courtiers. Clive understood that bureaucracy could be as deadly as armies. Contracts, letters, and complex systems of taxation became instruments of power, turning Bengal's prosperity into British profit. The locals watched, confused and alarmed. Farmers struggled under new demands. Artisans found themselves beholden to traders, and merchants learned that their profits no longer belonged solely to them. The rich tapestry of Bengal's economy, once a network of local exchange, was now systematically stripped for foreign gain. Yet the company's methods were clever. They did not openly declare war on the people. Instead, they relied on intermediaries, compliant local officials, bribed landholders, and corrupt administrators. Through them, they controlled the flow of information, monitored unrest, and ensured that any resistance could be anticipated and crushed before it spread. The art of subtle domination had begun. Meanwhile, Clive turned his gaze beyond Bengal's borders. India was a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and weaknesses. The company's success in Bengal became a template. Alliances forged with ambition, promises whispered in secret, betrayals carefully orchestrated. The map of India was slowly redrawn, not by armies alone, but by influence, strategy, and commerce. At the heart of this new order was a growing British bureaucracy. Officials who had once been clerks in distant offices now found themselves as magistrates, tax collectors, and governors. Their pens could command armies, their ledgers could determine life or death. Bengal became both classroom and laboratory, teaching the British how to rule vast populations with minimal resistance, a lesson that would echo across the subcontinent in the decades to come. But power always breeds tension. Mir Jafar, once useful, began to resent the shadow that followed him. The Nawab's wealth, his palace, his soldiers, all were carefully controlled, monitored, and limited. Every rebellion he considered, every independent act, was checked by the invisible hand of the company. Bengal's rulers were puppets, their strings pulled by men thousands of miles away, speaking in cold, precise letters and decrees. Even as wealth flowed to Calcutta, whispers of corruption spread. Zamindars enriched themselves while peasants starved. Merchants found themselves squeezed from both ends. The fertile lands of Bengal, once the jewel of India, were now ground in a slow, silent machinery of exploitation. And yet, outwardly, the company maintained the appearance of order, forts gleaming, trade bustling, rivers flowing with commerce. Meanwhile, Clive's reputation soared in London. He was celebrated as the man who had conquered Bengal without the vast armies many expected. But back in India, the seeds of resentment were being sown. Discontent simmered among nobles, soldiers, and farmers alike. The company had won the Diwani, but with it came responsibility, and a growing tinderbox of anger and rebellion, waiting for a spark. By 1767, the wheels of British administration were turning. Calcutta had transformed from a trading post to a hub of imperial power. Roads, warehouses, and offices sprang up, all designed to tighten the company's grip. Meanwhile, news from other regions, Madras, Bombay, the Marathas, and Mysore, reminded Clive that Bengal was only the beginning. India was vast, diverse, and full of opportunities, and he intended to master them all. And so, the stage was set for a new chapter in India's story. The slow, inexorable rise of British power through commerce, cunning, and bureaucracy. The battlefield had been conquered, but the real empire was built on contracts, ledgers, and the silent manipulation of those who held power in name only. Bengal had fallen, not just to guns, but to a system that would define colonial rule for centuries. Yet even in the shadow of this control, resistance lingered. Tales of Siraj-ud-Dowlah's downfall inspired whispers in distant courts. Maratha warriors, Mysore generals, and other regional powers observed, learned, and prepared. The company's triumph in Bengal was spectacular, but it had also painted a target on their back. India's story was far from over, and the empire of commerce had only just begun to taste the fragility beneath its gilded surface. This is the war that never was, where history's battles are rewritten and secrets of war come alive. The air over Bengal was thick with heat, dust, and dread. The year was 1764. The once proud Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah had long been a ghost in the company's ledger, and his allies had been scattered like ashes in the wind. But Bengal was far from pacified. The East India Company's grip tightened, yet the province's people whispered stories of rebellion, rumors of secret plots that could undo the traders turned overlords. Robert Clive had returned to England, his pockets heavy with wealth, yet his mind restless. Letters from Bengal painted a different picture than the one the stockholders in London believed. The company ruled over millions, yes, but control over men and land is never guaranteed. It is bought, borrowed, and maintained by fear, influence, and the invisible chains of debt. In Murshidabad, the palace that had once glittered like a jewel now bore the scars of neglect and manipulation. Mir Jafar, installed as puppet Nawab, ruled with trembling authority. Every decision, every order, came under the scrutiny of British officers who hovered like vultures, feeding off the confusion. Ordinary citizens felt the change most sharply. Grain taxes soared. Trade that had sustained generations was redirected to line the pockets of men half a world away. But the company underestimated the human element. Resentment is a force far more patient and insidious than any musket or cannon. Peasants whispered, soldiers complained. Merchants secretly funneled intelligence to those who still remembered the old Mughal days. Even the sepoys, trained and paid by the company, nursed memories of loyalty to lands that were no longer theirs. In 1764, the next storm began quietly. A group of local commanders, men who had fought under Siraj's banner, met under the cover of darkness. Their whispers carried a single truth. Bengal was not lost. It had been stolen, and they would take it back. They plotted not with swords alone, but with the cunning of men who knew every ledger, every treaty, every betrayal the company had orchestrated. Meanwhile, the British in Calcutta celebrated another successful harvest of trade revenue, oblivious to the undercurrent of unrest. They believed that money and a few loyal sepoys were enough to guarantee obedience. Yet even within their ranks, cracks were forming. Officers sent to collect taxes and suppress minor revolts returned with grim tales of resistance, hints that the people of Bengal were not as broken as they seemed. Then came the spark. It began in a small village along the Hooghly River, barely noticeable to anyone outside the province. Peasants refused to pay grain taxes. local traders stopped shipping goods. A minor skirmish erupted when a sepoy detachment attempted to enforce the company's orders. It was a small flame, easily ignored, but every empire is vulnerable to sparks in the right place. Across the province, Clive's successors in command realized the delicate balance of power was slipping. The company's control was more fragile than their ledgers suggested. Letters arrived from provincial officers, warning of unrest, murmurs of rebellion, whispers of alliances being formed in secret. For the first time, the idea of losing control, even temporarily, became a reality. And then came the decisive moment. In July of 1764, a coalition of discontented leaders and local armies launched a coordinated assault on key trade posts and minor forts. Not all of these attacks were violent. Some were strategic occupations, acts of sabotage, and clever deceptions that left the British officers chasing shadows. They realized that they were dealing not just with peasants, but with planners, strategists, and men who understood both European and Indian methods of warfare. Calcutta became a hub of tension. The British administration, accustomed to commanding obedience through contracts and bribes, faced the unfamiliar: uncertainty. Markets slowed. Ships remained in port. Communication lines faltered. Every day brought rumors, threats, and the possibility of a revolt that could undo decades of quiet conquest. Yet even as the unrest spread, the company's advantage remained formidable. Superior weaponry, disciplined troops, and control over critical ports meant that any rebellion could be contained, if the British acted decisively. But in history, decisive action is rarely simple. Every order issued carried the risk of betrayal. Every loyal sepoy could be swayed by a well-placed bribe. And every village that resisted could inspire 10 more to rise in turn. In the midst of this precarious balance, one figure emerged as a symbol of defiance. A young commander who had fought under Siraj-ud-Dowlah's banners, trained in both Mughal and European tactics. His name is lost to history, but his actions would leave a mark far larger than the British ledger could account for. He led his men with precision, striking at supply depots, cutting off reinforcements, and sowing chaos in the very areas the company considered secure. For months, the province simmered with unrest. The company's officers moved from village to village, trying to assert authority, but each attempt seemed only to fan the flames. Bengal was no longer a conquered land. It was a battlefield of shadows, where control could not be counted in troops or tax receipts, but in loyalty, fear, and strategy. Finally, by late 1764, the British realized a critical lesson. Conquest by trade and contract could never fully replace conquest by force. The invisible chains they had relied upon were fraying. Bengal's wealth was tempting, but its people, cunning, proud, and connected, refused to be fully subdued. The company had won the Battle of Plassey, yes, but the war for Bengal was far from over. And in this tension, the next chapters of India's story would be written, with war, negotiation, betrayal, and the quiet influence of those who refused to be silent. Every fort, every village, every ledger in Calcutta now carried the weight of potential disaster. The East India Company had created an empire not of blood alone, but even empires built on profit can bleed when faced with a populace unwilling to surrender. The events of 1764 were not widely recorded in European histories, but in Bengal they left scars. Traders, soldiers, and villagers all understood a single truth. Control could be taken, but it could also be lost. And the line between conqueror and conquered is often thinner than the edge of a knife. The company would adapt. It would rebuild, consolidate, and return with lessons learned. But the memory of defiance, of strategy, and of rebellion would remain in Bengal, a warning to anyone who believed that empires built on contracts could endure without ever earning loyalty, respect, or fear. This is the war that never was, where battles thought won are revealed in their true, hidden fury. The sun rose over Bengal in 1765, casting a harsh light on a land that had been caught between shadow and fire. Months of unrest had tested the East India Company's strength, patience, and strategy. The rebellion that began as whispers along the Hooghly River had grown into a web of resistance spanning villages, forts, and trade posts. For the company, victory was no longer assured by superior guns or disciplined troops. It demanded cunning, ruthlessness, and the ability to exploit divisions among the locals themselves. In Murshidabad, Mir Jafar's palace remained a gilded cage. Though he wore the crown of Nawab, every decision was watched, every word calculated to avoid British displeasure. Yet outside the palace walls, Bengal's people remained restless. Small-scale uprisings continued, emboldened by rumors of secret alliances and the possibility that the company's grip might finally falter. Traders delayed shipments, sepoys questioned orders, and villagers quietly defied taxes. The East India Company acted decisively. Troops were mobilized, forts reinforced, and envoys sent to negotiate with hesitant local commanders. Letters of pardon and promises of wealth were carefully balanced with warnings and intimidation. The company's strategy had shifted. Bengal would not simply be conquered by force. It would be absorbed through a combination of fear, loyalty, and manipulation. But the struggle was not merely military. It was psychological. Every officer in Calcutta understood that the province's wealth, its fertile fields, bustling trade routes, and rich cities, depended on more than soldiers. It required control over hearts and minds, a delicate dance between oppression and concession. And in that dance, missteps could cost everything. By late 1765, the tide of rebellion began to ebb. Coordinated attacks faltered under the weight of company reinforcements. Supply lines were resecured. Bribed commanders abandoned their allegiances to the rebellion. Slowly, the province came under a controlled, if uneasy, submission. Yet the memory of resistance lingered. Every village that had dared to defy the company became a lesson in the fragility of power. The East India Company's victory was decisive, but incomplete. They had established firm control over Bengal's administration, trade, and finances, and the province's wealth flowed into European hands like a river redirected. Yet beneath this surface lay tension, simmering resentment, and the knowledge that the conquered could rise again if opportunity and courage aligned. The company had won the battle, but the war for loyalty, the war for true dominion, was far from over. Mir Jafar remained on the throne, a puppet whose strings were pulled with precision. Clive's successors understood the lesson that history would later record. Empires are fragile constructs. Bengal had been subdued, not just through muskets or cannons, but through strategy, negotiation, and the exploitation of human ambition and fear. It was a victory that came at a cost. The constant vigilance of every company officer, the uncertainty of every trade, and the shadow of rebellion that would never fully disappear. And yet, for all its brutality and cunning, the conquest of Bengal set the stage for something far larger. The East India Company had not only secured a province, it had established a blueprint for empire. The lessons learned in the rivers and villages of Bengal would shape how they moved across the subcontinent, how they manipulated politics, how they extracted wealth, and how they survived, even thrived, in lands that were never truly theirs. For the people of Bengal, the outcome was a bitter mixture of inevitability and endurance. Life continued under British administration, yet the stories of defiance persisted. Every whispered rebellion, every act of subtle resistance, became part of the province's memory. It was a reminder that empires are built on the fragile foundations of obedience, and that power taken by force is never guaranteed to last forever. In the end, the battle for Bengal was more than a story of conquest. It was a lesson in strategy, human nature, and the relentless drive of ambition, both local and foreign. It showed how wealth, cunning, and force could reshape a region, yet also how the spirit of resistance could linger, quietly, like embers beneath ashes, waiting for the wind to ignite it once more. As the company consolidated its control, Bengal became the jewel of British India, rich, prosperous, and strategically critical. But every ledger of revenue and every report of submission carried a hidden truth. The province had not surrendered its heart, only its outward obedience. And that subtle defiance, though silent, would echo through generations, shaping the story of India long after the muskets were stored and the banners were folded. The conquest of Bengal was over, but the story of its people, its resilience, and the delicate balance between empire and rebellion had only begun. Every street, every river, and every palace held a story. Stories that would remind the world that even the mightiest conquerors can never fully own a land, nor the will of those who inhabit it.